Good morning. So we're here to talk, as Alexandra explained, about AI and ethics. So just to give a short framework for the discussion, we know that there is the possibility that AI can eradicate disease and make major improvements in the state of the world. So there's no question that AI will be adopted and that it's going to impact really every corner of society. But along with that, it means that complicated choices, including literally life and death decisions, will increasingly be made by machines. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And so there is a real effort going on now by standards bodies like the IEEE to hardwire ethics into the operating system of machines. But whose ethics are going to be used? Who should determine the value systems for artificial intelligence software? You've got a number of efforts that have surfaced. So the big Silicon Valley players, Google, Microsoft, IBM, and others have come together in an organization called the AI Partnership. And they're trying to establish some values, like maybe sort of building on the famous Isaac Asimov's law of robotics to talk about, what we want to protect privacy, we don't want to do harm, etc. Some people aren't super comfortable with handing the mission control for humanity to Silicon Valley and having some programmer who's trying to rush a product to market make decisions about what values the machine should have. So now there's a brand new initiative that's just recently been announced by the Knight Foundation along with MIT Media Lab and the Berkman Center at Harvard to bring in the social sciences and humanities and have them contribute to this discussion, this very important discussion about, what sort of values should be programmed. The question is there a way to bring society at large into the discussion? And that's where Iyad and his project at MIT Media Lab comes in. So, Iyad, tell us a little bit about the Moral Machine Project.
So, I'll talk a little bit about this specific project, but then we'll hopefully generalize the discussion a bit more broadly. But the modern scientific study of ethics has used a workhorse called the Trolley Problem. And the Trolley Problem is a kind of a thought experiment that was invented by philosophers a few decades ago. And the problem goes like this. A runaway train trolley is going to kill 5 workers who are stuck on a track. You are an observer, and you're unable to stop the trolley remotely. But what you can do is you can pull a lever that will move the trolley to a separate track, and if it does so, then the trolley will avoid the 5 workers, but it will kill 1 person who's standing on that other track. Now, obviously, you can argue, well, why doesn't the person jump? Why are these people stuck on the track and so on? But that's kind of beside the point. It's deliberately simplified in order to tease out a specific moral principle, which is, do we harm 1 person in order to minimize total harm and save 5 people? Now, over the last few, maybe 10 years or so, psychologists have been using this problem and slightly varying the problem in order to understand the contextual factors that affect our morality. And what we did was we created a driverless car version of this problem. And in this variant, it is not you as an observer who can pull a lever, but it is a programmer or somebody who's deciding how this car should be designed. And we imagine a car that is lost control for some reason. Maybe the brakes have failed, and the car is going to run over 5 pedestrians, but the car can swerve and kill a bystander on the side, or maybe kill its own passenger, which is a different, kind of a new quirk in this problem. So what we did was, first of all, we were interested in using this type of problem to understand how people think about machine ethics. Do they apply the same principles that they apply to the traditional trolley problem? But we also wanted to broaden the discussion further. So we created an online platform called the Moral Machine. And you can see it on moralmachine.mit.edu. And what it does, it randomly generates 13 scenarios. And every time you visit it, there'll be different scenarios. But we play with some aspects, some contextual factors, like, is the car choosing between fewer or more people? Are the ages the same, or is one group on average younger than the other? Sometimes we vary.
So, like, if you had a choice, should you kill 3 old people as opposed to a woman with babies and this kind of thing?
That's right. So again, it is a simplified scenario. There are only 2 actions, but what it does is it challenges you to think about, what moral principles would apply here, and also to appreciate the limits of those principles. So people start saying, I just want to minimize total harm. And then suddenly there's fewer people in the car, but they're children. And then you say, well, maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe age should be a factor. And then another case, you have people who are more numerous, but they're crossing a red light. If they're violating the law, should they deserve protection at the expense of others, even if that leads to more deaths and so on? Yeah.
How many people responded to these questions from the Moral Machine?
So we were kind of surprised by the broad attention that this got. So initially, it was supposed to be a companion website to a research paper that we wrote. But so far, last we checked, we got 22 million decisions from people from 160 countries. So it sort of inadvertently became one of the largest ethical surveys ever conducted in history. Which means we have a treasure trove of data now that we can. We're just beginning to jump into this data and extract lessons from it.
So, do you think that the answers that people gave could be used as a basis for programming ethics into autonomous vehicles? And would this be a way of people could be comfortable outsourcing the decisions in the same way that they do with, like, an elected politician who represents them and their views?
Well, I think this should certainly not be the only input into the regulations that will determine ethical behavior of cars. And the reason is because, our ethics changes. Actually, we are internally inconsistent when it comes to our ethics, and different people have different perspectives too. But I think what it can do is it can help us build a picture of what are the sort of major factors that can alter people's judgment. Are there things that people consider irrelevant and should be taken as irrelevant? Are there other cultural differences between different groups? So I think what needs to be done then is for us to take this data, extract insights, and then deliver this information to policymakers and regulators and other stakeholders. So basically, I think the regulation of autonomous cars and AI in general should take into account multiple stakeholders' opinions, whether it's the government, it's the tech industry, as well as the public. And what I'd like to do through this project is map out what the public thinks about these sorts of problems.
But let's talk about just how complicated that is, right? Because human beings are not consistent. We say we value something, but then our actions speak differently. So let's talk about how that played out in your own studies. In the case of if the car has a choice of killing, something goes wrong, and you either have to injure or kill people, pedestrians, or the people inside the car. People answered that in principle, they thought that the passengers in the car should be the ones that are injured.
If that leads to fewer casualties, yeah.
But then the same people said if that was the case, they would never buy such a car or ride in one, right?
Yes,
so
that's right.
It's a complicated to program machines to behave in the same way that humans would, because we don't always behave in the same way. So it's very different than this whole notion of machine learning, of machines following patterns and interpreting logical things, because humans are emotional and not always logical. And this also poses cultural issues, as you said, also pose challenges. So can you talk a little bit about the cultural differences that you've found and what the implications are for policy and legal decisions going forward?
So before I talk about culture, I want to say something about the moral hazard that you just described. So in our early study, we found indeed that people by and large agree that those cars should minimize total harm. So this is a utilitarian principle. In moral philosophy, it means take whatever action is best for society as a whole, even if that harms one individual. So people, when they think of themselves externally, they say, that should be the principle, but when they think of themselves in the car, obviously their opinion changes, which is exactly why we need to think of this problem as a social contract, because, that's what a social contract is. It restricts the freedoms, it constrains an individual in order to do what's best for the collective. And it's a way, that's why, for example, we have, we all agree implicitly that if one of us punches the other, we are subject to a law that may take the perpetrator and constrain their freedom. Maybe they would be jailed or fined, and so on. Of course, everybody would say, well, this law should apply to everybody else except me, but we all recognize that to live in a cohesive society that is best for all of us, it is in our interest to opt into this social contract. And I think we need to think of AI regulation in the same way. And this is what that study highlighted, that the real challenge is not what the car should do in a particular case, should it swerve or not. The real challenge is how do you design that social contract, and then how do you engage people into it, and how do you get buy-in into that social contract. Now, obviously, different countries, different cultures have different social contracts, even today, without AI. And we're beginning to see this already. So it's still too early to talk about the results in detail, but we have found, for example, that the tendency to prioritize minimizing total harm is slightly higher in Western countries, like North America and Western Europe, whereas in some other countries, you would find that people think the car has a slightly higher duty to its owner. And there's no right or wrong answer here. We can debate it all afternoon, but I think for me as a scientist, rather than a legislator, my goal is to map out these differences so that the legislators take them into account as they think about what should be universal and what should be culture-specific or jurisdiction-specific.
Well, that's a really good point, because we don't have any global consensus on what are basic human rights. We don't have a global consensus on what are basic human values. So it may be the case that the manufacturers of robots and cars will have to program them differently depending on which markets they're selling them in. And that can pose some interesting...
Absolutely. And I think it's important not to kind of ask these questions or confine them to one perspective, because, for example, I'm a kind of a multidisciplinary scientist, so I know little bits and pieces about different fields, and the sort of this small economist in me will say, well, as soon as you do this, there will be arbitrage. There will be people who would buy cars from one jurisdiction, put them in another jurisdiction, in which that gives the owner an advantage in terms of safety, for example. And again, the economic incentives of car makers would be to make cars that sell well, and cars sell well if they are safe for their owners. So unless we have a way to sort of like detect if there is any kind of malfeasance or something fishy, then I think we create incentives that will lead to outcomes we're not really comfortable with.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, over there.
I think the sort of what happens if you pre-commit to a set of rules first has kind of been demonstrated by Isaac Asimov himself. So Asimov wrote the 3 laws of robotics. The robot should not harm a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to be harmed. Should also not harm itself, and things like that. But then Asimov spent 30 years writing stories that show how these rules can conflict with each other. And then he came up with the 0th law, which says robot cannot harm humanity as a whole, which is kind of a lazy way to say there's all this other stuff that I haven't figured out. And I think, so I think we need an iterative process, and this is exactly what happened in the US. So the Department of Transport released regulations. The first, they wouldn't call them regulations, I think guidelines for automotive industry. And one of the points explicitly says, you need to document, so car makers who want to build autonomous cars need to specify exactly how they're thinking about ethical trade-offs and to document those, and to have to think about them explicitly, which is nice, and I like it because they're not pre-committing to anything. They want to learn, so the regulators want to learn also from the experience of car makers, but they want the car makers to also recognize that they're watching, and this is, they will be involved at some point in perhaps setting standards. So I think we're still at an early stage, but I think we cannot leave the ethical questions till later because the technology is moving very fast.
There's a question over here.
It's a very good question. So I think transparency is something that it's an intuition, when we think about human governance, we think of transparency as a good thing and also as a solution. But the question is transparency about what? In software, especially in machine learning software, transparency of the source code doesn't tell you anything about behavior, because the algorithm is simply a generic learning algorithm or pattern recognition algorithm that will optimize for something. And we can look at it a priori, and it really, how the algorithm behaves depends on when it's embedded in the real world, what data it picks up in this process, and so on. So I think what we need is transparency about behavioral outcomes. So transparency about what did a car programmed with operating system A seems to kill more pedestrians, on average, than a car programmed with operating system B. I think we need to know that. And then we can take corrective action. And that's much more tractable because it's about the outcomes that we care about. Think of the way we think about humans. We don't look into their source code in their brains to know if they're ethical, but we're still able to regulate them by observing their behavior against some standard. And I think that's a much more a plausible approach here, especially that these cars are becoming so complex approaching the, eventually perhaps the human brain.
I think there's going to be some very interesting liability questions that will surface. Here in Europe, there's already legislation being proposed that would require AI to justify their decisions. So it will have to be based on something, and there will have to be a certain amount of transparency and clarity on how these things were programmed. We could go on for hours on this topic, and I know there's other questions, but I'm told that we have to wrap up. So with that, please give a nice round of applause to Iyad. Thank you very much.